appreciate that reminder. Keep me on my game here. All right, so I want this to disappear. So we have cellular respiration here. This first molecule, C6H12O6, is glucose. That's combining with oxygen to output here some carbon dioxide and water. Awesome recognition that this is almost exactly the opposite reaction of photosynthesis. All right, so as we go through the slideshow through till tomorrow, I want you to keep these questions in mind. Why do humans breathe oxygen? What's the point? Why don't we breathe carbon dioxide? And can an organism survive without oxygen? Why or why not? So at the end of tomorrow, we'll be able to answer these questions. So which organelle makes energy? The mitochondria. It's the powerhouse of the cell. So here we have glucose and oxygen going in. We have carbon dioxide and water, and that all so valuable ATP coming out. So we're doing some of this cellular respiration in the mitochondria. So there are two types of respiration. We have anaerobic respiration. This is making that glucose into ATP without the use of oxygen. And aerobic respiration. This is doing that same thing, converting glucose into ATP with the use of oxygen. So one is without, one is with oxygen. And my next question for you in column G, not the quick write, is what type of respiration do you think that human muscle cells do? Anaerobic or aerobic? All right, seeing lots of aerobic. Waiting for a few more answers here. Aerobic. A few more people typing. All right, so I'm saying, everyone's saying aerobic. You are correct. If you put anaerobic, you are also correct. Human muscle cells do both. They do both anaerobic and aerobic. Crazy. So if you chose either one, you are correct. If you chose both, you are technically more correct. So great job using some of your thinking skills there. And I don't know how many of you have already taken a quick look at this either. So to oxygen or not to oxygen. Anaerobic respiration, like I said, is respiration that happens without oxygen, no oxygen. This occurs in the cytosol. So when we're looking at our cell, the cytosol is that watery, gooey stuff that all of the organelles, if it's a eukaryote, are sitting in. It's just kind of like the insides that everything's floating in if we're looking at a prokaryote. They don't have like a nucleus-bound membrane. They have some ribosomes floating around in there. But the cytosol is where this anaerobic respiration is happening. And anaerobic respiration is two processes. Something called glycolysis, which we're going to talk about next, and alcoholic or lactic acid fermentation. So it goes from glycolysis to one of those types of fermentation. Aerobic respiration, on the other hand, is respiration with the use of oxygen. So this occurs both in the cytosol and the mitochondria. So if there's a mitochondria, we know that's an organelle. It's going to happen inside of that organelle. And aerobic respiration has several processes. Glycolysis, that's happening in anaerobic as well as aerobic. Something called the Krebs cycle, and an electron transport chain. That sounds familiar. There was an ETC in photosynthesis. This one is very similar, different, but still fairly similar. So let's look into anaerobic respiration. Glycolysis, let's break down this word into roots. So glyco means sugar, glucose, glyco, they sound very similar. That means sugar. And lysis means to split or break apart. Sort of calling back to our last unit, thinking about our organelles. Lysosomes are sort of our garbage people. They take out all of our waste, they break it down. They're splitting up those molecules to get rid of that waste. So lysosomes also do some splitting, again, using those roots, trying to make things a little more familiar. So glycolysis is sugar that's getting broken. So in organisms that perform cellular respiration, so plants, they do photosynthesis, animals, bacteria, they perform cellular respiration. And glycolysis is the first stage. It doesn't need oxygen. Oxygen is not one of the reactants for glycolysis. So anaerobic organisms can do it, as well as aerobic. Glycolysis occurs in the cytosol of all cell types. That means prokaryotes do it, eukaryotes do it. Specifically, animal eukaryotic cells. Again, plant cells do photosynthesis, but animal cells do cellular respiration. With or without oxygen, again, it's happening in the cytosol of both pro and eukaryotic cells. So glycolysis, here we go. We have a pointer. We have here a glucose molecule is what we're starting with. There are 6 carbons there. And we're breaking it apart. And to do that, we need to use a little bit of energy. So we're breaking apart this glucose into 2 molecules of 3 Cs, 3 carbons. And those 3 carbons are going to get rearranged. In that process, we're going to create ATP and a new electron carrier molecule called NADH. So let's look at this in 2 parts. We're going to break it down. Part 1, glucose. So here at the top is our C6. There are 6 carbons in a glucose. This is our glucose molecule at the top. It's broken in half into 2 3-carbon sugars. So to make things easy, it just says C3, carbon 3. There's 3 carbon molecules that it's been broken in half into. To do this, we need to use 2 ATP. We got to break down some ATP to get energy so that we can make this split happen. This sucks. This is a huge bummer. The whole point of cellular respiration is to create ATP, but we just used some. Well, what happens next? Part 2, we're going to take those 3 carbons that we just made by splitting that glucose in half, and they're going to go through a little bit of a transformation. They're going to get rearranged into a new 3-carbon molecule called pyruvate. These 2 processes are happening at the same time because we have identical C3 molecules that are getting rearranged into pyruvate. During this rearrangement process, we're going to create NADH from NAD+, and ATP from NADP for ADP. NADH is that electron carrier. It sounds very, very familiar to NADPH from photosynthesis. The only difference is this one does not have a phosphate group, so there's no P. The way that I can tell the difference between these that helps me, my mnemonic, is that the NADPH has a P, so it happens in photosynthesis, which starts with a P. Maybe helpful, maybe not. That's how I remember. So we're going through this. Each one of these C3 molecules is going to produce 1 NADH and 2 ATPs. So total, we're going to end up with 2 NADH and 4 ATP. We're at a net gain of 2 ATP. Hey, we made some ATP. We're going to use it. We had to spend a little bit, but we have a net gain, which is great. Looking at NADH, before we move on really quick, I have another question for you. So column H in the click right. It is an electron carrier. Which type of reaction in photosynthesis makes electron carriers? The light dependent or light independent? I'm trying to remember photosynthesis, light reactions, Calvin cycle. Which one makes these electron carriers? light dependent, dependent. Perfect. Dependent. Awesome. So if we remember back to photosynthesis, we're going through this whole photosystem 2, etc, photosystem 1, ending up with our NADPH. So we're creating at the end of our light dependent ATP from ATP synthesis, but from our light reaction, our chain of electron traveling, we get our electron carriers, our NADPH. So some similarities here. We're making electron carriers to use those electrons later on in our processes. All right, so in summary, looking at glycolysis as a whole, it occurs in the cytosol, all types of cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And this can happen with or without oxygen. So it's not dependent upon that oxygen. If we don't have oxygen, we can still do glycolysis. If we do have oxygen, we can still do glycolysis. So the steps are glucose, this C6 at the top, is broken into 2 C3 sugars. Boom. And to do that, we have to use 2 ATP. Now, the next step, these C3 molecules are going to be rearranged or converted into a new 3-carbon molecule called pyruvate. During this rearrangement process, we're creating some NADH, those electron carriers, and ATP, energy. All right, so after glycolysis, so glycolysis happens regardless of this oxygen being present. We can go one of 2 routes. No oxygen, we go into fermentation. If there is oxygen and there are mitochondria, we can go into cellular respiration. So this is where the oxygen becomes important. If there is oxygen, we go one way. If there's no oxygen, we go the other pathway. So today we're going to go with the other pathway, but first, what's the big deal? So with our anaerobic, we're making 2 ATP, so net. Remember, we're using 2, making 4. Our net is 2 ATP. This is totally enough ATP for bacteria. They're super small, not doing a lot. 2 ATP is enough for one process here of one go around through glycolysis. However, if we use oxygen and go through cellular respiration, we can make about 40 ATP. That's a lot. And all eukaryotes need energy, like a lot of energy. In column I, for me, why do you think it's important for eukaryotes to have more of this energy? Why would they need all this extra ATP than something like bacteria? Functions, do work, more complex. To fuel the nucleus along with other organelles. Nice. Great. Great. So what I'm seeing here is there's more stuff to do in a eukaryotic cell. So not only are eukaryotes bigger, that means now they have more stuff to fuel, but they have all of these different things happening. They have all these organelles doing their different jobs, making proteins, making energy, all of this stuff. They need that energy, that ATP, to do those functions. They're much more complex. They need more energy. Great. Way to use your critical thinking skills. All right, so now we're going to talk about fermentation, this non-oxygen anaerobic process. So at the end of glycolysis, we have our NADH and our ATP, but we can't do it again unless we have NAD plus to turn into that NADH. Fermentation solves that issue. So here in the top half, we have our glycolysis happen. Glucose goes in, ADP turns into ATP, or sorry, yes, our net gain of ATP. We're also taking NAD plus, turning it into NADH. 2-pyruvate, so our rearranged 3 carbon molecules, and some carbon dioxide is going to be part of that product. The bottom part here, this one specifically is a alcoholic fermentation. But what this fermentation process here is doing is it's breaking down that NADH, releasing those hydrogen ions and electrons, so that the glycolysis can now have NADP or NAD plus molecules to start all over again. So the fermentation and the glycolysis work in this cycle of their own. It just feeds into each other. We're going to make some NADH. You're going to break that NADH so I can make more and just go in this process so that the end result will be more ATP. The NADH and NAD plus are cycled. The result will be ATP. Again, every turn of this glycolysis, we get 2 ATP as our net gain. We're not going to go too deep into fermentation because it doesn't really apply to us. It's mostly bacteria and very, very small single-celled organisms. But there are 2 types, lactic acid and alcoholic fermentation. Lactic acid is an anaerobic process that we do. So if you ever go to the gym or you're part of a sports team and you're working out, trying to get swole, and you get sore the next day or even a few hours later, that soreness is caused by a buildup of lactic acid. So in our bodies, usually when we're doing things where we're using a lot of oxygen, like working out, I'm going to run 10 miles today. Even though we're breathing heavily, we may not always get all the oxygen we need, but we still need all of the energy. So to sort of compensate for that lack of oxygen, which we're going to learn about how that plays in with cellular respiration tomorrow, our bodies go into this anaerobic respiration, which is something that we can do. And part of the product of that is lactic acid. So whenever you feel sore after working out or walking too far, or running or whatever, that is because your body went through anaerobic respiration and you have a buildup of lactic acid, this lactic acid fermentation. It's not harmful, it's not bad for you. It's just something our body does to sort of boost our ATP levels. Bacteria also produce this in yogurt. So a lot of our yogurts have what's called active cultures, and those are, for us, at least in yogurt, those are good bacteria that help our guts. It helps us digest stuff better. And those bacteria in yogurt, they also go through lactic acid fermentation and produce lactic acid. And the last type is alcoholic fermentation. So here we have some bread. It's rising because there are these little organisms called yeast in this leavened bread. And it's rising because those yeast are undergoing this fermentation. And as we saw in that cycle of alcoholic fermentation, carbon dioxide was one of the products. So those bubbles that you see in bread, those big air holes, those are a result of some yeast going through alcoholic fermentation, and they're essentially exhaling that carbon dioxide bubble. So alcoholic fermentation is why we have airy, fluffy bread. That's as far as we're going to go today.